Her husband thought he outsmarted her, emptying their savings account. But at the divorce hearing, the morning sun crept through the thin curtains, casting soft golden stripes across the bedroom walls. Grace stirred, slowly waking from a peaceful sleep, the faint hum of the city beyond their apartment windows blending with the rhythmic sound of Nathan's steady breathing beside her. She smiled to herself, feeling the familiar warmth of routine, a life she thought was safe and stable. The alarm clock blinked 6:30 a.m. in soft red digits, but Nathan remained asleep, his arm lazily draped over her waist. For a brief moment, it felt like any other Saturday morning, filled with the quiet comfort of shared spaces and unspoken understandings built over years of marriage. But as she reached for her phone on the nightstand, intending to scroll through emails before starting the day, a single notification would unravel everything she believed about her life. Grace squinted at the screen, her thumb hovering over the banking app. It was a habit she'd formed, checking their joint account to ensure bills were covered, groceries accounted for, and savings untouched. But today, the numbers stared back at her like a silent scream. The balance was nearly zero. Blinking rapidly, she refreshed the app, thinking it must be an error. Their savings, carefully built over years of sacrifices, skipped vacations, and modest living, had vanished overnight. Her heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking along her temples. She sat up, her movements jolting Nathan slightly, but he didn't stir. Clicking through the recent transactions, she saw large withdrawals made at odd hours, all to an unfamiliar account. The sums weren't small, they were life-changing amounts. Their emergency fund, gone. Their future, stolen. Rising from the bed on trembling legs, Grace moved quietly into the living room, her mind buzzing with disbelief. She opened her laptop, hoping for clarity, but the digital records only confirmed her worst fears. The transfers were deliberate, systematic, and, most shockingly, unauthorized by her. The pit in her stomach grew heavier with every click. She scrolled further and found the pattern stretched over the last few weeks, hidden in plain sight. How had she missed this? Questions flooded her mind, but one rose above the others. Why would Nathan do this? Her hands trembled as she sipped the now-forgotten coffee growing cold beside her laptop. The man she trusted, the partner she believed in, had emptied their account without a word. Hours passed before Nathan finally emerged from the bedroom, stretching and yawning like nothing was amiss. Grace watched him from across the kitchen island, her heart pounding. The sight of him, barefoot, disheveled, scratching his chin absent-mindedly, felt foreign now. He greeted her casually, kissed her cheek as if everything was fine. But she didn't respond. She slid the laptop toward him, the banking statement open on the screen, her face void of expression. Nathan's carefree smile faltered as he glanced down, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's this?" he asked, feigning confusion, but his voice carried a hint of something else, an edge, a flicker of annoyance rather than surprise. Grace's voice was steady, though her insides churned. "You tell me." Nathan's eyes darted from the screen to her face, then back again. The casual demeanor vanished, replaced by something colder. "Oh, that," he muttered, shrugging as if she'd asked about forgetting to take out the trash. "I moved the money. It's not a big deal." Her breath caught in her throat. Not a big deal? The betrayal hit harder than the numbers on the screen. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but all she could manage was a whisper, "Why?" Nathan didn't flinch. His response was a dagger cloaked in arrogance. "Because I earned it. You just stayed home." The words echoed in her mind like a cruel joke, reverberating through the empty spaces where trust once lived. "I earned it. You just stayed home." Grace felt her knees weaken, but she steadied herself against the countertop, refusing to let him see her break. Nathan poured himself a cup of coffee, casually sipping as if he hadn't just dismantled the foundation of their marriage with a single sentence. His indifference was more suffocating than the betrayal itself. She stared at him, the man she had loved, now a stranger wrapped in familiarity. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by something sharp and dismissive. Grace's voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "We built this life together, Nathan. Every decision, every sacrifice, we made them as a team." He chuckled, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "A team? Don't kid yourself. I went to work. I brought in the money. You were comfortable." His words were calculated, designed to belittle, to reduce her contributions to nothing more than background noise. But Grace wasn't just hearing him, she was seeing him for the first time. The cracks in their relationship, once dismissed as stress or miscommunication, now glared like neon signs. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the growing emotional distance, they weren't coincidences. They were symptoms of a betrayal carefully nurtured over time. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Grace barely spoke, her mind racing with what-ifs and how did this happen. Nathan acted as though the confrontation had been a minor inconvenience, scrolling through his phone, making plans with friends, laughing at texts. The audacity was infuriating. By evening, she realized she couldn't sit silently in the shadow of his deceit. She needed answers, and more importantly, she needed to reclaim her dignity. So, when Nathan casually announced he'd be meeting a colleague for drinks, she followed him, not out of curiosity, but determination. What she found shattered the last remnants of denial. At a trendy downtown bar, Nathan wasn't with a colleague. He was with her, Sophie, the young, flirtatious woman Grace had met once at his office party. They laughed over drinks, their body language intimate and familiar. Grace watched from a distance, her heart pounding not with heartbreak, but with clarity. Nathan hadn't just stolen their money, he'd orchestrated an escape plan, one that never included her. She left the bar quietly, her tears replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The apartment felt colder when Grace returned, its silence pressing against her like a weight. She sat in the dim light of their once cozy living room, staring at the empty space where Nathan's keys usually rested. The man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd worn his face with ease. But Grace wasn't the same woman she was that morning. Something inside her had shifted, hardened. Betrayal had a way of forging strength from brokenness, and she was about to become someone Nathan never anticipated, someone unafraid to fight back. The next few days were a blur of meticulous investigation. Grace combed through every financial record, every bank statement, and email. She unearthed more than just missing funds, she discovered hidden investments, secret accounts, and evidence of Nathan's manipulations that extended beyond their marriage. It wasn't just personal, it was financial fraud, and Nathan had been sloppy. His arrogance blinded him to the one person capable of exposing him, the woman he underestimated the most. Each new discovery fueled her determination, turning heartbreak into strategy. But the most shocking revelation came not from a bank statement, but a dusty file tucked away in their shared office, a prenuptial agreement Nathan had insisted on years ago, under the guise of protecting their future. Grace remembered feeling hurt then, questioning his trust even before they said their vows. She'd signed it anyway, believing in their love. Now, as she read the fine print, she found a clause Nathan had likely forgotten. a clause that stated any proven infidelity or financial deceit would nullify the agreement, granting her legal claim to half of everything he thought he'd stolen. Grace stared at the document, her heart pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. Nathan thought he'd won. He had no idea the game had just begun. Grace waited until Nathan came home that evening, his tie loosened, and the faint smell of whiskey lingering on his breath. He sauntered into the apartment with the same arrogant swagger, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Grace's calm exterior. She was seated at the dining table, the prenuptial agreement neatly placed in front of her alongside a stack of documents detailing his financial betrayal. The soft hum of the city filtered through the window, a stark contrast to the tension coiling tightly in the room. Nathan paused when he saw her, his smile faltering slightly. "What's with the paperwork?" he asked, feigning casual curiosity. Grace didn't flinch. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit," she said firmly. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of the heartbreak she'd buried under layers of determination. Nathan raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her newfound assertiveness, but complied. He leaned back, crossing his arms with an air of indifference. "If this is about the money, Grace, I've already explained. It's mine. I earned it." Grace's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening around the edge of the table. "You didn't just drain our account, Nathan. You stole from me. You lied. And you cheated." She slid the photos she'd taken outside the bar across the table. Nathan's face darkened, the smugness giving way to a flicker of panic before he masked it with a dismissive chuckle. "Oh, come on, Grace. You're being dramatic. Sophie and I, it's not serious. You know how these things are." His words were dripping with condescension, as if infidelity was a minor oversight. But Grace didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Good. Because it's going to look really bad when the judge sees all of this." She tapped the prenup with deliberate precision. Nathan's smirk faded completely. Nathan's expression shifted from arrogant dismissal to barely concealed rage. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, Grace saw the fragile ego beneath his confident facade. "You think you're going to win?" he spat, standing abruptly and knocking his chair backward. "You're nothing without me, Grace. Nothing." The words were meant to wound, but they fell flat against the armor she had built from his betrayals. She stood too, her gaze unwavering. "I was something long before you. You just never noticed." Nathan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the apartment, a punctuation mark on the life they'd shared. Grace didn't cry. She gathered the documents, organized them neatly into a folder, and placed it beside her growing stack of evidence. She knew what she had to do. She contacted Olivia, her old friend from college who'd gone on to become a successful attorney. Olivia listened patiently as Grace recounted everything, the financial deceit, the affair, the prenup. When Grace finished, there was a pause on the line before Olivia spoke. "You have a case," she said simply. "And we're going to bury him." The next morning, Grace woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She packed Nathan's remaining belongings into boxes, leaving them neatly stacked by the door. His presence in the apartment felt like a stain she was determined to scrub clean. As she sipped her coffee, she glanced at the folder on the table, her heart steady. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming her life. Nathan thought he could outsmart her, but he'd underestimated the one thing he couldn't control, her resilience. Grace's plan was meticulous. She knew Nathan thrived on appearances, his job, his social circles, his image as the successful husband with the perfect life. So she chose his most vulnerable stage, his office. Dressed in a sharp suit, her hair pulled back with precision, she walked into his workplace with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. The receptionist recognized her, offering a polite smile that faltered when Grace bypassed her desk without explanation. Nathan was in a meeting, surrounded by colleagues and clients, his charisma on full display. Grace waited until he was mid-sentence before pushing open the glass conference room door. The room fell into a stunned silence. Nathan's face paled when he saw her, a flicker of fear quickly masked by forced bravado. "Grace," he greeted, his voice strained. "What are you doing here?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the center of the room, placed the stack of documents on the table, and looked directly at him. "I thought I'd return what's yours," she said, her voice cutting through the room's heavy silence. The documents detailed his financial fraud, his affair, and the prenup clause. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Nathan's colleagues glanced at the damning evidence. His face turned crimson, beads of sweat forming along his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Grace turned on her heel and left without another glance. The sound of whispers and hushed judgments followed her down the hall. Nathan's carefully crafted world had begun to crumble. Nathan's downfall was swift. His company launched an internal investigation, uncovering discrepancies in financial reports Grace hadn't even known about. His reputation, once untouchable, dissolved under the weight of his own arrogance. Friends who had once admired him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Grace watched from a distance, her emotions complex, a mix of vindication and quiet sorrow for the life she thought they had. Despite the chaos in Nathan's world, Grace faced her own challenges. The financial strain was real. She'd been left with debts Nathan had carelessly accumulated in their joint name. Olivia worked tirelessly, filing motions to protect Grace from the legal fallout of Nathan's actions. Court dates loomed like ominous clouds, but Grace stood firm. She found a modest apartment, started working part-time to stabilize her finances, and surrounded herself with people who genuinely cared. Each small victory, paying a bill on time, receiving a supportive message from a friend, was a step toward healing. One evening, as she unpacked boxes in her new place, Grace found an old photo of her and Nathan from their honeymoon. They looked happy, carefree. She stared at the picture for a long moment before tearing it in half and tossing it into the trash. It wasn't bitterness that fueled the act, but acceptance. She was no longer the woman in that photo, and Nathan was no longer the man she thought she'd married. She had lost everything she thought mattered, but in the wreckage, she was finding herself. Nathan's arrogance had been his armor, but as his world crumbled, desperation seeped through the cracks. He called Grace repeatedly, his messages oscillating between anger and pleas for forgiveness. She ignored them all. He even showed up at her new apartment once, disheveled and agitated, demanding to talk. Grace didn't open the door. She watched from behind the curtain as he stood outside, his once confident posture reduced to a fragile silhouette. His desperation grew when he realized he was losing not just his career but the narrative he'd controlled for so long. He reached out to mutual friends, spinning stories of Grace's supposed betrayal, claiming she'd ruined his life out of spite. But the evidence spoke louder than his lies. Grace had the truth on her side, and Olivia made sure it was front and center in every legal proceeding. Grace found unexpected support in people she never thought would care, colleagues from her old job, neighbors from her previous apartment, even strangers online who resonated with her story. Their messages of encouragement were small lights in the darkness, reminders that she wasn't alone. Nathan's attempts to vilify her only highlighted his own failures. His words lost power, drowned out by Grace's quiet strength and undeniable truth. The days leading up to the court proceedings felt like a delicate balancing act for Grace. Each morning, she woke with a heaviness in her chest, the weight of her past life trying to pull her back into despair. But as she moved through her modest new apartment, surrounded by simplicity instead of the material illusions Nathan once prized, she found a strange sense of peace. The clutter was gone, not just in her living space, but in her heart. Olivia remained a steady presence, her sharp legal mind uncovering angles Grace hadn't even considered. Together, they meticulously crafted a case not fueled by revenge, but by the pursuit of justice. Grace attended meetings with Olivia, each one peeling back more layers of Nathan's deceit. Bank statements, hidden accounts, fraudulent documents, it was all there, woven together in a web of arrogance Nathan never thought would unravel. But amidst the cold, hard facts, there was something warmer growing: resilience. Grace was no longer a woman clinging to the remnants of her old life. She was building something new, even if the foundation was made from the ashes of betrayal. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for winning the case, but for reclaiming the parts of herself Nathan had tried to erase. Late one evening, after a long day of legal strategizing, Grace sat by her small kitchen window, sipping tea and reflecting on her journey. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who believed in fairy tale marriages and unconditional love. That girl was gone, but in her place stood a woman who had faced the worst and refused to break. The reflection staring back at her wasn't defined by Nathan's betrayal. It was shaped by her strength, her courage, and her unwavering determination to rise. The thought made her smile, a genuine one this time, soft and steady like the dawn after a long, dark night. While sorting through a dusty box of old papers she'd salvaged from their shared apartment, Grace stumbled upon a document she'd forgotten existed. It was tucked between birthday cards and faded photographs, a thin, crisp envelope marked with Nathan's handwriting, for safekeeping. Curious, she opened it, expecting perhaps an old tax form or insurance policy. But what she found made her heart race. It was a signed contract, a private agreement Nathan had made with a former business partner, detailing financial obligations and ethical conduct clauses. Buried in legal jargon was a clause that could destroy him in court. The contract explicitly stated that if Nathan was found guilty of financial misconduct, not only would he face legal consequences, but all assets tied to his name would be subject to equitable division, regardless of any prenuptial agreements. Nathan had crafted this document at a time when he thought he was untouchable, using it as leverage in his business dealings. But he had underestimated the very person who now held it in her hands. Grace felt a surge of adrenaline, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that she held the key to his downfall. Olivia's reaction the next day was immediate and strategic. "This changes everything," she said, her eyes gleaming with professional excitement. The document wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon. It nullified Nathan's defenses, exposing him to legal vulnerabilities he thought he'd buried. They added it to their growing arsenal, preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. For Grace, it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about holding Nathan accountable, not just for what he did to her, but for the lies he told the world. The hidden document was more than proof, it was poetic justice. The courtroom loomed like an imposing monument to truth, its cold walls and polished floors reflecting the tension in Grace's chest. She sat beside Olivia, the hidden contract securely filed among other crucial documents. Nathan entered the room with his high-priced attorney, his tailored suit unable to mask the nervous twitch in his jaw. His arrogance had faded slightly, replaced by a veneer of forced confidence. But Grace saw through it. She recognized the subtle signs of a man unraveling, a flicker of hesitation in his step, the way his eyes darted around as if searching for an escape route. The proceedings began with formalities, each legal term echoing like a distant drumbeat. Nathan's lawyer painted a picture of him as a successful, hardworking man burdened by a vindictive ex-wife. Grace listened silently, her face composed, her heart steady. She didn't need to defend herself with words, her evidence would speak louder than any narrative Nathan could fabricate. When it was Olivia's turn, she approached the bench with the grace of a seasoned litigator, her voice clear and unwavering as she presented their case. Then came the moment Grace had been waiting for. Olivia introduced the hidden contract, the courtroom falling into a hush as its contents were read aloud. Nathan's confident facade crumbled. His face paled, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The clause was damning, leaving no room for manipulation or excuses. It exposed not just his financial deceit but his blatant disregard for legal and ethical boundaries. The judge's expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something sterner, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Grace didn't smile, not yet. But inside, she felt the first true taste of victory, not because she had won, but because Nathan had finally lost control. In the days following that pivotal courtroom session, Grace found herself fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. The tide had turned, but the battle wasn't over. Olivia urged her to dig deeper, to uncover any lingering threads Nathan might have left behind. Grace scoured through emails, bank statements, and forgotten files, each discovery weaving a tighter net around Nathan's carefully constructed lies. What she found was more damning than she'd anticipated: evidence of offshore accounts, fraudulent transactions, and connections to shady business dealings Nathan had always dismissed as just part of the game. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Nathan's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He had manipulated not just her but colleagues, friends, even his own family. His web of deceit extended far beyond their marriage, touching every aspect of his professional life. Grace compiled the evidence meticulously, creating a timeline that painted a vivid picture of his double life. Each document, each email, was a testament to his arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable. But Grace was proving him wrong, piece by incriminating piece. Olivia presented the new evidence in court with surgical precision. Nathan's lawyer faltered, struggling to maintain the narrative they'd crafted. The judge's patience wore thin as the truth unfolded, undeniable and unrelenting. Nathan sat in silence, his once confident demeanor reduced to a hollow shell. Grace didn't revel in his downfall. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her heart steady. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth was on her side. One evening, while reviewing financial records late into the night, Grace stumbled upon a clue she almost missed, a small transaction buried among countless others, insignificant in amount but suspicious in pattern. She traced it to an obscure account Nathan had opened under a shell company's name. Curious, she dug deeper, enlisting Olivia's help to navigate the legal hurdles of accessing the account details. What they discovered was staggering: a hidden fortune Nathan had siphoned off over the years, concealed through a network of fraudulent investments. The account wasn't just a financial secret, it was a symbol of Nathan's betrayal on a grander scale. He had been planning his escape long before their marriage fell apart, building a safety net for himself while leaving Grace with nothing. The realization hit hard, but it also solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting against the very idea that someone like Nathan could manipulate, deceive, and walk away unscathed. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Olivia presented the findings. Nathan's face turned ashen, his confidence obliterated. The judge's gavel felt like a final, resounding note in a symphony of justice. Grace sat silently, her heart calm. She had faced the worst and emerged stronger. Nathan's hidden account wasn't just evidence, it was the final nail in the coffin he'd built with his own lies. After the courtroom revelations, the tension seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken verdict. Grace sat alone in her small apartment that night, staring at the city lights flickering beyond her window. The triumph in court had been satisfying, but it didn't erase the emotional wreckage Nathan had left behind. She thought about everything she'd uncovered, the hidden accounts, the fraudulent transactions, the betrayal woven into the fabric of their marriage. It was overwhelming, yet strangely grounding. This was her reality now, and despite the scars, she was surviving. Grace took a deep breath, savoring the rare moment of peace. She'd been living in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the next revelation, the next courtroom battle. But tonight, there was nothing to prepare for. The silence wasn't empty, it was a testament to her strength. She had faced Nathan's worst and remained standing. No more lies, no more manipulation, just the quiet hum of resilience. The storm had raged, but she had become the anchor, unshaken and unmovable. But deep down, Grace knew this wasn't the end. Nathan was a man driven by ego, and men like him didn't crumble quietly. His silence wasn't an admission of defeat, it was a prelude to retaliation. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, that gnawing sense that the worst wasn't over. The calm she felt was fragile, temporary. The real storm was still brewing, hidden behind the legal victories and fleeting moments of peace. The morning Grace officially filed for divorce was both liberating and surreal. She stood in the sterile courthouse hallway, the crisp legal papers clutched in her hand, her heart surprisingly steady. It wasn't the dramatic moment she'd imagined, no tears, no lingering doubts. Just quiet determination. The clerk stamped the documents with mechanical precision, unaware of the emotional weight behind each signature. With that simple act, the marriage Grace had once believed would last forever was reduced to paperwork, dates, and legal jargon. Walking out of the courthouse, Grace felt lighter, as if she'd shed a skin she'd outgrown. The sun was brighter, the air crisper. She wasn't Mrs. Nathan Bennett anymore. She was just Grace, no hyphen, no attachments, no shadows of a man who had tried to define her. The thought made her smile, not out of bitterness, but relief. The chains had been legal as much as emotional, and now they were broken. Later that evening, Nathan showed up at her apartment unannounced. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, a stark contrast to the polished image he'd always maintained. "You filed," he said, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. Grace met his gaze without flinching. "I did." There was nothing left to say. Nathan's charm, his manipulation, they had no power here. Grace had reclaimed herself, and no amount of pleading or rage could undo that. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading into insignificance. The day of the divorce hearing arrived like an uninvited guest, its presence heavy with anticipation. Nathan strutted into the courtroom, his arrogance on full display despite the legal battle he was losing. Dressed impeccably, flanked by his expensive attorney, he greeted acquaintances with forced smiles, pretending the walls weren't closing in around him. But beneath the surface, Grace could see the cracks. His confidence was a mask, brittle and fragile, and she was about to shatter it. Grace sat quietly beside Olivia, her demeanor calm, her heart steady. She didn't need theatrics or outbursts to make her case. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. Nathan's lawyer tried to spin a narrative of a misunderstood husband, a victim of circumstances. But it was weak, transparent, built on the same foundation of lies Nathan had lived by. Grace listened without emotion, her focus sharp, her resolve unshaken. When it was her turn to speak, Grace stood tall, her voice clear and steady. She didn't dramatize or embellish. She told the truth about the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal hidden behind closed doors. She presented the documents, the hidden accounts, the contract Nathan had signed without reading the fine print. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words undeniable. Nathan's face paled as the reality of his situation settled over him. His empire wasn't crumbling, it had already collapsed. He just hadn't realized it yet. Throughout the proceedings, Grace maintained a composed silence that spoke volumes. Nathan expected outbursts, emotional breakdowns, anything that would give him the upper hand. But Grace's restraint was her greatest weapon. She sat with dignity, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than any argument. Every time Nathan glanced her way, searching for a reaction, he was met with indifference. That was his true punishment, not just the legal consequences, but the realization that he no longer had power over her emotions. The courtroom sessions dragged on for weeks, filled with testimonies, cross-examinations, and legal jargon. Nathan grew increasingly frustrated, his charm failing to sway the judge or distract from the overwhelming evidence against him. His lawyer's arguments became more desperate, trying to paint Grace as vindictive, but the facts were irrefutable. Nathan wasn't a victim. He was a man exposed, stripped of the lies he'd hidden behind for years. Grace's silence became a narrative of its own. People in the courtroom whispered about her strength, her poise under pressure. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in the face of adversity. Nathan couldn't understand it. He had spent years believing he was the center of her world, the axis on which her life turned. But Grace had shifted that axis, and Nathan was left spinning in the void, irrelevant and powerless. The turning point in the trial came unexpectedly, during what seemed like a routine session. Olivia stood, presenting the final piece of evidence, a collection of emails, financial transactions, and the hidden contract that sealed Nathan's fate. The courtroom grew tense as each detail unfolded, painting a picture of deceit so vivid it couldn't be ignored. The judge's expression hardened, the gravity of the situation clear in his stern gaze. Nathan's face was a study in disbelief and fury. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering frantically, but it was futile. The evidence was irrefutable, his guilt undeniable. Grace watched without a flicker of emotion, her heart steady. She didn't need to gloat or celebrate. The truth was its own victory, and Nathan's downfall was the inevitable consequence of his choices. As Olivia concluded her presentation, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The judge took a deep breath, his verdict clear in the weight of his words. Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to savor the win, but to acknowledge the journey, the pain, the resilience, the growth. When she opened them, she saw Nathan for what he truly was, a man defeated, not by her, but by his own arrogance. In the weeks following the verdict, Nathan's life unraveled with poetic precision. His assets were frozen, his reputation in tatters, his once loyal friends disappearing like shadows at dawn. The media caught wind of the scandal, their headlines brutal and unforgiving. Nathan Bennett, the man who had it all, and lost everything. Grace read the articles without satisfaction. His downfall wasn't her victory, her survival was. Nathan's company collapsed under the weight of financial scrutiny, lawsuits piling up like unpaid debts. His social circles, once filled with admiration and envy, turned cold and distant. He was no longer the charming businessman with a perfect life. He was a cautionary tale, a man brought down by his own deceit. Grace watched from afar, her heart free of resentment. She had moved beyond the need for revenge. Her life was no longer tied to Nathan's failures. But the true defeat wasn't in his financial ruin or public disgrace. It was in the quiet moments Nathan faced alone, haunted by the realization that he had lost the one person who had truly believed in him. Grace's absence was his greatest punishment, a void he could never fill with money, status, or lies. And as he sat in his empty apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life built on deceit, Nathan finally understood the true cost of betrayal. Nathan's final humiliation came not in a courtroom, but in the ordinary routines he once took for granted. Grocery stores where whispers followed him, former colleagues crossing the street to avoid him, phone calls left unanswered. His name was synonymous with disgrace, his charm ineffective against the harsh reality of his downfall. The man who had once thrived on admiration was now invisible, ignored, forgotten. One afternoon, Nathan walked past Grace's new business, a small, thriving cafe she'd opened with the settlement money. It was filled with laughter, warmth, and life. She stood behind the counter, radiant and at peace, surrounded by people who respected her not for who she had been, but for who she had become. Their eyes met briefly through the window. Nathan's face was a mask of regret, but Grace simply smiled, a genuine, serene smile. Not out of spite, but freedom. Nathan turned away, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had lost. Not the money, not the status, but Grace. The woman he thought he controlled, the life he thought he owned. But she had slipped through his fingers, not as a victim, but as a victor. And as he walked away, swallowed by the anonymity he once feared, Nathan realized the truth: he hadn't just lost her. He had lost himself. Nathan's life continued to spiral beyond the courtroom walls, each day peeling away another layer of the carefully curated persona he had built over the years. His once lavish apartment grew emptier as he sold off possessions to cover mounting legal fees and debts. The sleek furniture, the expensive art pieces, gone. What remained was the hollow shell of a man surrounded by bare walls, echoing the emptiness he tried to fill with power and control. The financial institutions that had once courted him with luxury credit lines now hounded him with relentless calls. His email inbox, once filled with invitations to exclusive events, became a digital graveyard of unpaid bills and legal notices. Nathan's downfall wasn't just public, it was deeply personal. The realization that he had orchestrated his own collapse was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. Despite his attempts to regain control, nothing seemed to work. He tried reaching out to former business associates, hoping for a lifeline, but they distanced themselves quickly, unwilling to be associated with his crumbling reputation. Even his family, once blinded by his charm and success, grew cold, ashamed of the scandal he dragged them into. The final blow came when his professional license was suspended due to ethical violations uncovered during the trial. His career, the very thing he believed defined his worth, was gone. Nathan found himself sitting alone at a rundown cafe, staring blankly at a rejection letter from yet another job application. The man who had once believed he was invincible now faced the harsh truth: without his wealth and status, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a shadow of his former self. Grace, meanwhile, thrived in the quiet aftermath of the storm. She no longer needed to glance over her shoulder or brace herself for Nathan's manipulations. Her life had taken on a new rhythm, one marked by independence, purpose, and peace. She had opened a small community center using part of her settlement, offering workshops and support for individuals who had experienced financial or emotional abuse. It wasn't just about helping others, it was about reclaiming her narrative. Each day she walked through the doors of her center, she felt a sense of accomplishment far greater than anything Nathan's empty promises had ever provided. Her story had shifted from one of betrayal to one of resilience, and with every life she touched, she solidified the truth Nathan could never escape. She had won, not just the case, but her life back. Nathan's fragile world took another hit when Sophie, the woman he had so confidently chosen over Grace, turned her back on him. In the early days of their affair, Sophie had been enchanted by Nathan's charm, his polished image, and, most importantly, his wealth. But as his fortunes dwindled, so did her interest. She tolerated his growing bitterness for a while, but it wasn't long before the cracks in their shallow relationship became too wide to ignore. Sophie, who had thrived on the luxury Nathan provided, wasn't prepared for the harsh reality of his financial ruin. Their lavish dinners turned into cheap takeout, romantic getaways became distant memories, and Nathan's once charismatic confidence morphed into bitter resentment. One evening, Nathan returned to the small apartment they now shared, only to find Sophie packing her belongings. Her face, once warm with affection, was cold and indifferent. "I can't do this anymore, Nathan," she said bluntly, not even trying to soften the blow. "You're not the man I thought you were." Nathan's temper flared, fueled by a mix of humiliation and desperation. He tried to convince her to stay, promising that he'd rebuild his life, that things would get better. But Sophie wasn't interested in promises without substance. "I was never here for love," she admitted with brutal honesty. "I was here for the life you could give me. And that life is gone." With that, she walked out the door, leaving Nathan alone in a space that felt emptier than ever. Sophie's betrayal was a mirror reflecting Nathan's own choices. He had discarded Grace, the woman who stood by him during his struggles, for the illusion of something better. Now, standing amid the debris of his failed relationship, he realized the depth of his mistakes. The irony was cruel yet fitting. Nathan had believed he was irreplaceable, but in the end, he was just another stepping stone in Sophie's pursuit of her own ambitions. Alone and defeated, Nathan finally faced the truth he'd been avoiding. He had destroyed everything meaningful in his life with his own hands. While Nathan sank deeper into despair, Grace flourished in ways she never imagined. Her new business, a cozy cafe that doubled as a community hub, became a beacon of warmth and connection. Nestled on a quiet street lined with trees, the cafe had large windows that bathed the interior in natural light, creating an inviting atmosphere. Grace filled the space with simple decor, soft colors, comfortable seating, and shelves of books donated by locals. The walls displayed art from aspiring artists in the neighborhood, turning the cafe into a living canvas of community expression. Every morning, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft hum of conversations, a stark contrast to the sterile, tension-filled environment she had once endured with Nathan. Grace found joy in the simple routines, greeting regular customers, experimenting with new recipes, and watching strangers become friends within the space she had created. Her confidence grew with each passing day, not because of external validation but from the satisfaction of building something meaningful on her own terms. She hired staff who had faced hardships similar to hers, providing them with not just jobs but a sense of belonging. The cafe wasn't just a business, it was a testament to resilience, a physical manifestation of her journey from victim to victor. People came not just for the coffee but for the story woven into the very fabric of the place, a story of loss, growth and triumph. Despite her success, Grace remained humble. She often reflected on her past, not with bitterness but with gratitude for the lessons learned. She understood now that her worth was never tied to Nathan or the life they had shared. Her identity wasn't defined by titles or relationships but by the strength she discovered within herself. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the cafe window, a cup of tea in hand, watching the world go by with a peaceful heart. The scars of her past were still there, faint reminders of battles fought and won, but they no longer defined her. Grace had reclaimed her life, not just by surviving but by thriving, and that was a victory far greater than anything Nathan had ever taken from her. Nathan's descent into rock bottom was both swift and unrelenting. After Sophie's departure, he found himself alone in an apartment he could no longer afford, surrounded by unpaid bills and eviction notices. His attempts to find work were met with closed doors and polite rejections, his tarnished reputation preceding him like an unwelcome shadow. The man who once reveled in his status and influence was now invisible, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among former colleagues. He sold the last of his valuables, a designer watch, a few pieces of expensive clothing, to cover basic expenses, but it wasn't enough. Hunger became a familiar companion, and the sharp pangs served as a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Nathan's pride, once his defining trait, eroded with each passing day. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the reflection of a man he no longer recognized. His once sharp features grew gaunt, his eyes hollow with regret and exhaustion. The streets he used to walk with confidence now felt foreign and unforgiving. He often wandered aimlessly, passing by places that once symbolized success, restaurants where he dined with clients, buildings where he closed lucrative deals, now just monuments to a life that felt like someone else's. The weight of his mistakes grew heavier, suffocating him with the realization that he had no one to blame but himself. In his darkest moments, Nathan thought of Grace, not with anger, but with a hollow ache of regret. He remembered her kindness, her unwavering support during the early days of his career, and how effortlessly he had taken it all for granted. The contrast between her current thriving life and his own desolation was unbearable. He had believed she needed him to survive, but the truth was brutally clear: it was he who had needed her. Nathan had built his empire on arrogance, but without Grace's foundation of loyalty and love, it had crumbled to dust. Rock bottom wasn't just a place, it was a reckoning, and Nathan had nowhere left to run from the truth. Fate dealt Nathan one last, devastating blow on an ordinary afternoon. Desperate for work, he stumbled into a job interview at a small firm, his resume now a flimsy shield against the weight of his disgrace. The office was modest, nothing like the high-rise buildings he once commanded. He waited nervously in the lobby, his heart pounding with a fragile hope he hadn't felt in months. But when the door to the interview room opened, his fragile composure shattered. There, standing confidently with a clipboard in hand, was Grace. She had been invited as a guest consultant for the firm, her expertise in business development now highly sought after. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. Nathan's face flushed with humiliation, his confident facade crumbling completely. Grace's expression remained calm, her eyes reflecting nothing but quiet indifference. She walked past him with grace, no pun intended, acknowledging his presence with a polite nod, as if he were just another face in the crowd. Nathan's heart sank, not because she ignored him, but because her indifference spoke louder than any words ever could. She had moved on, and he was nothing more than a distant memory. As Nathan left the building, his footsteps heavy with defeat, he realized this was the true end, not the courtroom verdict, not Sophie's betrayal, but this moment of absolute insignificance. He was no longer part of Grace's story. She had written new chapters without him, pages filled with triumph, resilience, and growth. Nathan had been reduced to a footnote in her life, a reminder of a lesson learned, not a scar that lingered. That realization, more than any legal loss or financial ruin, was the final blow, the undeniable proof that he had lost the only thing that ever truly mattered, her respect. The weeks after Nathan's final humiliation passed quietly for Grace, filled with a gentle rhythm of work, friendships, and peaceful solitude. Her cafe thrived, becoming more than just a business. It was a place of connection, healing, and growth for both herself and the people who found comfort within its walls. But even in the midst of her busy days, Grace often found herself reflecting on her journey, the path she had walked from betrayal to independence. The memories weren't as sharp anymore, they had softened with time, like old photographs faded at the edges. What once felt like raw wounds had healed into faint scars, reminders not of pain, but of resilience. She realized that her past with Nathan, though painful, had been a catalyst for discovering her own strength. Without it, she might never have found the courage to create a life truly her own. Sitting by the large window of her cafe one evening, watching the soft glow of the city lights reflect off the rain-soaked streets, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The woman she had become was far removed from the one who once believed her worth was tied to a man's approval. She had shed the layers of doubt, fear, and dependency, replacing them with confidence, self-respect, and a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose. It wasn't about the victories in court or the financial settlements, it was about reclaiming her narrative. She had written her story not with bitterness, but with courage, and that realization filled her with gratitude. Grace no longer needed to define herself by what she had lost. Instead, she celebrated what she had gained, a deeper understanding of herself and the unwavering belief that she was enough. On nights like this, Grace thought about Nathan not with anger or sadness, but with detachment. He was a chapter she had closed, a lesson learned, and nothing more. She didn't wonder what had become of him, because it no longer mattered. His absence was as insignificant as a shadow fading with the setting sun. Grace had moved beyond the need for closure from him, she had given that to herself. She sipped her tea, savoring the warmth, and smiled softly. Life wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about growing through it. And in that growth, Grace found her true reflection, not as someone broken, but as someone beautifully whole. One crisp autumn afternoon, Grace received an unexpected invitation to speak at a local business conference. The event focused on entrepreneurship and resilience, highlighting individuals who had overcome personal and professional challenges to achieve success. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she wanted to revisit her past in such a public way. But after some thought, she realized this was more than just a speaking engagement, it was an opportunity to share her story on her terms, to inspire others who might be standing at the same crossroads she once faced. When the day arrived, Grace stood backstage, her heart beating with a mixture of nerves and excitement. She wasn't afraid of public speaking, she was afraid of confronting the remnants of her past. But as she stepped onto the stage, greeted by warm applause, the fear melted away. The spotlight didn't feel harsh, it felt empowering. She spoke candidly about her journey, not as a victim of betrayal but as a woman who had found her voice through adversity. She shared lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of rebuilding from within. Her words weren't rehearsed, they flowed from the heart, raw and authentic. As she concluded her talk, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Grace looked out at the sea of faces, many with tears in their eyes, and felt a surge of pride, not for the applause, but for the connection. She had turned her pain into purpose, her story into a beacon for others. After the event, people approached her, sharing their own stories of heartbreak and recovery. It was in those moments Grace realized that her experiences had value beyond her own healing, they had the power to inspire change in others. The recognition wasn't about fame or accolades, it was about the quiet, profound impact of authenticity. Grace had found her calling not in spite of her past, but because of it. Months later, as Grace walked through a bustling farmer's market on a sunny Saturday morning, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Anna, an old acquaintance from her past life with Nathan. Anna had always been polite but distant, more of a social obligation than a true friend. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Grace wondered if Anna would turn away, awkwardly avoiding the encounter. But instead, Anna approached with a warm smile, her demeanor noticeably different from the days when Nathan's charm dictated their interactions. "Grace," Anna greeted, her tone genuine. "I've been meaning to reach out. I saw your talk at the conference. You were incredible." The words caught Grace off guard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were sincere. They chatted for a while, catching up on life, careers, and mutual acquaintances. Anna confessed that she'd admired Grace's courage from afar, especially after everything that had happened with Nathan. "You're an inspiration," she said softly, and Grace felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. As they parted ways, Grace realized how much had changed, not just in her life, but in how others saw her. She was no longer the woman defined by her relationship with Nathan. She was her own person, respected for her strength, not her association with someone else's success. That brief encounter reaffirmed what Grace already knew deep down. Her past didn't define her, but it had shaped her into someone resilient, confident, and unapologetically authentic. And for that, she was grateful. The final court hearing regarding Nathan's bankruptcy was scheduled on an overcast morning, a stark contrast to the warmth Grace felt inside. She debated whether to attend, knowing she wasn't legally required to be there. But something compelled her, not out of spite, but out of a desire for closure. She wanted to witness the official end of a chapter she had long since outgrown. Walking into the courtroom, she felt a sense of detachment, as if she were observing someone else's story. The woman who had once trembled with fear and uncertainty in this very room now walked with quiet confidence. Nathan sat at the defendant's table, noticeably diminished. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by ill-fitting clothes and a gaunt expression. The arrogance that once radiated from him had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of the man she used to know. He barely glanced her way, and Grace felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, just indifference. The proceedings were swift, the judge's verdict firm and final. Nathan was declared bankrupt, his remaining assets liquidated to cover debts he could never fully repay. As the judge adjourned the court, Grace stood, smoothing the front of her dress with steady hands. She didn't linger or gloat. She simply walked out of the courtroom, her heart lighter with each step. The legal ties that had bound her to Nathan were officially severed, but emotionally, she had let go long before. Closure wasn't about the verdict, it was about the journey, one that had led her from betrayal to empowerment. Stepping into the crisp afternoon air, Grace inhaled deeply, savoring the freedom that came with finally being untethered from her past. Years later, Grace sat on the balcony of her new home, overlooking a garden she had nurtured from scratch. The flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, each petal a testament to growth and resilience. She sipped her tea, the warmth seeping into her hands, and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of her past felt distant, like a story she had read long ago, familiar, but no longer defining. She had built a life filled with meaning, surrounded by genuine connections and a profound sense of self-worth. Grace had traveled the world, met incredible people, and pursued passions she never thought possible. But the greatest victory wasn't in the achievements or the milestones, it was in the quiet moments of contentment, the peace she carried within her. She had learned that strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about embracing the cracks and letting the light shine through. Her life was richer not because it was free from hardship, but because she had grown through it with grace and courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over her garden, Grace smiled softly to herself. She whispered words meant only for her heart. I was never lost. Just hidden. And with that simple truth, she closed the final chapter, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Her story wasn't one of revenge or triumph over others. It was a story of reclaiming her life, finding her voice, and thriving in the quiet, powerful victory of self-love and resilience.